Welcome everyone to another random walk down Mill Street. The topic for this evening is Isaac de la Penha, the search for a Hazzan, Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to Labrador. Just out of curiosity, raise your hand either in person or on the screen if you know what I'm talking about already. Just out of curiosity. Anybody? No, that's a good sign. Okay. Maybe one or two. Okay. Okay. Where is Labrador? Okay, good question. Labrador is a province in the northeast of Canada. You have Newfoundland and Labrador, and underneath that is Quebec. And it's very sparsely populated area of Canada. So that's Labrador. You can Google it if you wish. That is where Labrador is, the north eastern part of Canada, on the Atlantic coast. Okay, hope that answered that question. So where is my screen share? I think it is here. Okay. So I want to start. How do I make this less than full screen? Is there a way I can do that? I don't know. Okay. I want to start by telling you about the Hazzan at the turn of the 20th century at Sheretz Israel. His name was Abraham Chaim Nieto. Now, Nieto was an excellent Hazzan. He had been born in London. He came to New York in the 1870s, I think, 1880s, and he became Hazzan here at Sheretz Israel. The year was 1886, and he replaced his brother, David Chaim Nieto. Both of them deserve classes of their own, presentations of their own, which I hope to get to one day. But the important thing that you should know about Abraham Chaim Nieto is that although he was an excellent Hazzan, and an even better sofer, he had his run-ins with the Board of Trustees of Sheretz Israel. And that is the setup for what's going to come next. And I'll just read to you the last paragraph of Dr. Poole's biography. Dr. Poole, in his Old Faith in the New World, goes through each of the Chazzanim and gives you short little biographies, a page, a paragraph in some cases. And so for Abraham Chaim Nieto, he says, his relations with the congregation were anything but smooth. He was individualistic and impatient of the discipline which organizational life necessarily imposes. Okay. His non-cooperative attitude strained the goodwill of the trustees. Over a considerable period of his incumbency, he was re-elected for terms of 6 months, or 3 months, or even 1 month, instead of the customary term of 1, 2, or 3 years. Throughout most of the year 1899, Sheretz Israel tried to induce him to accept the position in Newport, Rhode Island, to no avail. Eventually, a break came. At the end of 1901, after 15 years of service, Abraham Chaim Nieto's relations with the congregation came to an end. And he goes on, he says it didn't mar the fact that he was not the Hazzan. He was still beloved by the congregation, and he continued to come to the synagogue. A little more there, but that's what you need to know is that in 1901, the assistant Hazzan, the assistant minister, Abraham Chaim Nieto, was let go and ceased to be the Hazzan at Sheretz Israel, which meant that the only clergyman working at the synagogue was Henry Pereira Mendes. For a fairly large congregation, they needed a new Hazzan. And so that's where we're going to pick up our story. Labrador is legally part of the province of Newfoundland. Or is it? That will be a direct question of what we're going to have here. We'll get there later. Okay. Okay. So this is Abraham Chaim Nieto, who was ended his service for the synagogue in 1901. Shortly thereafter, the president of the congregation, L. Napoleon Levy, receives this letter, which is in the Sheretz Israel archive, written by the minister of the Sheretz Israel congregation of Montreal, the Spanish-Portuguese congregation of Montreal, which is also named Sheretz Israel. I'm just trying to get the little panel here. Here we go. I'm going to read this letter too because it's quite interesting. I have to move this out of the way though. Okay. My dear Mr. Levy, or Levy, we would say here, I feel assured that this is January 1902, January 1902, writing from Montreal to L. Napoleon Levy, Parnas of Sheretz Israel in New York City. My dear Mr. Levy, I feel assured that you credit me with a sincere interest in the welfare of the congregation over which you preside so ably. And therefore, I am convinced that you will not misconstrue the motive which prompts me to address this letter to you. What an interesting start. Don't misunderstand me. I have your best interest in mind. Here we go. I hear that the electors have sustained the trustees and that the position of the assistant Hazzan is consequently vacant. Now, I don't know if Mark Aaron is here, but this is a very interesting language, which we will not address here very closely, but the electors have sustained the trustees, which means the trustees fired the Hazzan, but it wasn't until the electors ratified it or sustained it that that was official, which is quite interesting. I don't think that would happen today, at least not really. But anyway, the electors of the congregation, meaning the congregants who get to vote, have sustained this action, and now there's a vacancy. Permit me to express the earnest hope that you will take advantage of the opportunity to secure the services of a man who will invest the position with dignity and restore the chazanut of your teba to what it used to be in former years. You do not require me to tell you that it is in an Orthodox Portuguese synagogue, the reverential and tuneful reading of the prayers is of first importance, and that everything else is secondary. I want to frame this and put it on my wall. It's the greatest thing ever. What's important in the Portuguese synagogue is the tuneful, reverential and tuneful reading of the prayers. That's the most important thing. Everything else is secondary. A good chazan leads the congregation to sing the numerous responses. Oops, I made that going too fast. Here we go. The numerous responses which are so prominent a feature in our beautiful ritual. And with a good chazan, you have a congregation of worshipers and not simply a listless audience. I firmly believe that a good assistant chazan would do a great deal towards the strengthening of your congregation in every way. You have not forgotten the rare charm with which Hazzan Lyons of blessed memory invested your services, and I do earnestly hope that now that there is an opportunity, a determined effort will be made to revive the glories of the old days. Pardon me for venturing to make this suggestion. I believe, and believe me, that I would not presume to address you in this way were I not imbued with a fervent tone. What is it? Fervent love, for our beautiful minhag, and with a profound interest in the welfare of your congregation. And it goes on. But what a letter! What a letter to receive from the Parnas. At this point now, Meldo de Sola is other than Henry Peramendi is the rabbi of the minister of Sheretz Israel, he's the next most prominent Portuguese minister in America, and he is the son of Abraham de Sola, who was, one of these giants of the rabbinate of North America in the 19th century. So it's no slouch. He knows him well. He knows him personally. He is a big name in the S&P world. He's a big name in the American Orthodox world. And he's writing a letter to the president saying, use this opportunity to get a good chazan. because that's really what matters for a Portuguese congregation. Quite interesting letter. So the next thing that happens is the Sheretz Israel begins to look for a Hazzan. And they take out an advertisement in the newspaper in Amsterdam, the Jewish newspaper called the Central Blad for Israeliten in Nederland. That is the oldest and still operating today Jewish newspaper in Amsterdam, in Holland. And here you have the advertisement here: Spanish Portuguese Israelite Gemeinde, Sheretz Israel in New York, and they're seeking an assistant Hazzan who knows the Portuguese minhag and can supply certificates that they know Hebrew and are God-fearing, moral people. And this is L. Napoleon Levy, New York, 20 Broad Street. It wasn't the only place that they searched. Here is a letter from Alfred Lyons, who was one of the board members of the synagogue at the time, that he received from the Parnas in Suriname. This is from Paramaribo, March 1902. Dear Sir, I duly received your esteemed favor of the 18th of February asking for my assistance in securing in this colony in Suriname the services of an assistant Hazzan for your congregation. I sincerely regret that I am not in a position to meet your wishes, not knowing anyone in this colony whom I could recommend for the vacant position. I may add that also the Portuguese Israel congregation Tzedek Shalom in this colony is up to date, or as of this date, in want of a good Hazzan, and could not even succeed in finding someone who could answer the most necessary requirement. That's the Parnas of the Portuguese community in Suriname responding to Sheretz Israel's request to recommend someone for the position. But they took this ad out in Amsterdam and they got some requests, some answers. And the archives of Sheretz Israel have some of the literature. So here is a letter written the 16th of February, which is just 2 days after this advertisement appeared, to Mr. L. Napoleon Levy. Dear Sir, in English, which is also good, interesting. Having read your advertisement in the Dutch Jewish newspaper for a Hazzan, which he spells with a G, I take the liberty to reflect upon it. I am 36 years old and married. We have 3 children, the youngest being 6 years. I know the Portuguese minhag very good, also all kinds of prayers and songs of the service. My teacher, the Reverend Brandon, Hazzan of our congregation, has given me an excellent documentation to prove that I'm able to accomplish this charge. And then he goes on. This was a letter of a man named Isaac de la Pena, who we will speak about shortly. This letter came with some supporting documentation, including the note from Hazzan Brandon, which is right here, which is in Dutch, which I don't speak, but says that Isaac de la Pena knows the minhagim of the Portuguese community and recommends him as Hazzan. That's February 16th, 1902. It also has a letter in English, again, from the chief rabbi of the Portuguese community, whose name was Palace. And this says, this is a pretty simple, just a certification. Chief Rabbi of the Portuguese Jewish Congregation of Amsterdam certifies that Mr. Isaac Abraham de la Penha is, for as much as he knows, of a religious and moral conduct. The advertisement said to provide documentation that you know the Portuguese minhag and that you are a religious and moral person. So the application now has a letter from the applicant and supporting documentation as requested in the advertisement. The Sheretz Israel took all their applicants and made a little page of the information they received about them. And I think this is quite interesting. I hope that I'm not embarrassing anybody to read it. Everyone here is long, long dead. Some of their family members may still be alive. I don't know. But it says here, Mr. Carrito, not allowed to be a candidate. Doesn't tell us why, but not allowed to be a candidate. Then you have Mr. Alvarez Vega, who I believe is an ancestor of one of our congregants, Boaz Alvarez Vega. I don't know for sure. I'll have to ask Boaz if anyone knows him. Maybe they can ask him too. He says he's a very honest man, very good Jew, very good voice, but was too nervous to be examined with the result of the rule in his language of Jewish language. So he couldn't receive the approbation of anyone in Amsterdam. So he's taken off the list. And then the next candidate, Mr. Isaac de la Penha, very fine man, very good voice, very good Jew, but the physician was afraid his voice not being strong enough for our large synagogue. Yeah, some other interesting here, but this is the person I want to talk about today, Mr. Isaac Abraham de la Penha, who ended up getting the job here in New York City in 1902. In 1901, Abraham Chaim Nieto vacates the position, and 1902 they put an ad in, and later that year they hire Isaac Abraham de la Penha. And here on this page you can see there's not a lot of information about him or not a whole lot documents or pictures I could show you, but here is from a service in 1905 for the 250th anniversary of Jews in America. You can see him here listed as the assistant Hazzan. Here was a little news article from a newspaper in New York City in 1902, which was the year that he was hired, which says that in the afternoon services, this is for Thanksgiving, so it's in the first week of December. So that the afternoon services of Thanksgiving in Sheretz Israel, Reverend Isaac de la Penha officiated. Reverend Henry Peramendes was prevented from being present owing to indisposition, and the sermon was given by Henry S. Morris, which I believe really should be Morias at his request, called Our Causes for Thankfulness. But here you see Isaac de la Penha. Here's a picture of him as the Hazzan in New York in 1905, from 1902 to 1908. Here we have the yearbook of the synagogue, something that was really well done in 1908, and I wish we sort of could do today. And it has a report from the congregation and all the different societies on the year that just passed. And you can see here, officers of the congregation for the present year, this is 1908. The minister is Henry Peramendes. The assistant minister is Reverend Isaac de la Penha to December 1907. And who is his replacement? Reverend David de Solapool from December 1907. And then later on in the booklet, it tells you, this is from a report from the Parnas, says, we have regrettably relinquished the services of Reverend Isaac de la Penha as assistant Hazzan. During the years that he has been with us, he has gained the respect of all and has largely contributed to the dignity of our services. Then it tells you why he was no longer Hazzan. Reverend Dr. David de Solapool of England succeeds him in office. A call was extended to him in 1906 by the trustees, which he accepted, pending the completion of his university course in Germany. We have every reason to believe that our choice has been a wise one. So Isaac de la Penha leaves and goes immediately to become the Hazzan in Montreal, beginning later that year in 1908. And David de Solapool comes in to be Henry Peramendes' assistant. Now, I should just say, it's not a scientific rule or fact, but the function of the minister here at Sheretz Israel was twofold. There was the Hazzan, and there was the lecturer. We might consider the rabbi, the preacher. And they had one's function was to lead the services, and the other function was to give sermons and act as what we would consider the rabbi. In the middle of the 19th century, those were two different people. And then with the hiring of Henry Peramendes in 1877, he took on both roles. But when he did so, he couldn't do the whole job himself, and they would hire an assistant to serve basically as the Hazzan. And so there was a series of Hazzanim under his tenure, which Isaac de la Pena was one of. As far as I know, Isaac de la Pena never preached a sermon at all. So he was really a Hazzan. David de Solapul, on the other hand, was hired with the intention that he would be the assistant and later on successor to Henry Peramendes. So different function a little bit, not merely a Hazzan, but also as a preacher, which will be an interesting fact for later on when they hire other Hazanim in the 20th century, which we're not going to address tonight. Anyway, Isaac de la Pena had this tenure for 6 years or so, 1902 to 1908, here as the Hazzan in Sheretz Israel. I don't have any recordings from that time. I have no idea what his voice sounded like, other than it was reported to be pleasant, and he was respected by all in the congregation, and that's all I know about him. There is a little indication that he tried to get a job. He tried to be relieved of his contract and get a job, I think, in Jamaica or maybe in Curacao, and the trustees of Sheretz Israel didn't let him. They said, no, you have a contract here, you got to stay here. And whether that was nice or not nice, I don't know. But that's an indication that they wanted him here. They didn't want him to leave. And so he was the Hazzan here for 6 years. He then goes to Montreal and becomes the Hazzan there and the assistant minister to the person who wrote the letter to El Napoleon Levy in 1902, Meldola de Sola. Meldola de Sola was the rabbi, the minister, and Isaac de la Pena was the assistant, the Hazzan. And he was the Hazzan there for many years, 20 or 30 years. He was I think it's almost 30 years in Montreal. Here's a picture of him from Montreal. And this is just to show you that he steps right in. This is a newspaper article from 1908. So he leaves December 1907 New York. He arrives in Montreal in 1908. And here is an article from 1908. And he is already participating in a Zionist convention in Montreal. So he's off and running as a minister there. And if you search the newspapers, you'll see he officiates weddings, officiates funerals. So he is a member of the clergy from 1908 until his death, which is 1935, I believe, 1936. And now we get to the unusual part of the story. Here is, I don't know if you can see it or not, an article from the New York Times dated March 13th, 1927. I'll read it to you. It's not that long. March 13th, 1927. Isaac de la Pena has been the Hazzan there since 1908, so he's there 19 years when this is being written. Montreal man who claims grant was given ancestor will start legal fight. That's the subtitle of the article. Having won Labrador by recent judgment of the Privy Council, the colony of Newfoundland will soon have to fight to retain about a quarter of the prize. For Rabbi Isaac de la Pena of the Spanish and Portuguese congregation here is preparing to uphold before the Newfoundland courts his claims to a huge grant on the Atlantic coast ceded to an ancestor in 1697 by William of Orange, also known as William III, King of England. What a great start of an article. So Isaac de la Pena was the Hazzan in Montreal, which is in Quebec. From about 1900 until 1926, the British, so the Canadian, so Quebec and Newfoundland were at odds over who owned Labrador. Newfoundland is like off the coast, and Labrador is on the mainland of Canada, and Quebec is just south of it. And so they're fighting over who owns Labrador. And they take their battle to the Privy Council, which is the court in England, Supreme Court or whatever you want to call it. And they adjudicate that dispute and rule in Newfoundland's favor. So Myman said earlier that it's the don't even know what the right language that he used, but it's part of Newfoundland, and that is correct. But that was never accepted by Quebec, even after the ruling came down. And you see that sometimes even today. They're not fighting over it, but they don't really accept that it's Newfoundland's property. But when that court case came down in 1926, Hazzan de la Penha said, "Hey, this is a good time for me to tell everyone in the world and in the country that actually Isaac de la Penha, owns Labrador. Why? Because in 1697, William of Orange granted it to his ancestor." And here I'll read the rest of the article. "All that is necessary for the suit to be entered at St. John's is possession of certified copies of ancient documents. Saul Eliasaph, counsel for the rabbi, explained, the judgment of the Privy Council awarding Labrador to Newfoundland merely means that we shall transfer our claim from Quebec to Newfoundland. Our claim and our rights are in no way affected by the judgment. In 4 countries, searches for the essential documents are in progress. The lawyer says he can lay his hands on the original grant of 1697 by which William of Orange, then at the Palace of Loo, granted to Joseph de la Penha that section of what is known as Labrador lying between the 60th degree of longitude and the 55th degree of latitude. The area is east of a line running north and south from Hopedale on the sea coast and includes Hamilton Inlet and Lake Melville, and its southern boundary cuts the Atlantic shore a little above Cape St. Louis. There is another document, the lawyer asserts, by which at the death of the original grantee, William of Orange transferred the grant to Daniel de la Penha, son of Joseph de la Penha. And still another document is alleged to show that in 1732, Daniel de la Penha was actively operating his grant and the hunting and fishing rights that went with it. Other papers are said to establish that David de la Penha obtained transfer of the grant on the death of his brother Dan. So that's the little surprise that I want to tell you about. It's not the story doesn't have a strong ending because what happens is they put this claim in and then they're trying to perfect their claim by finding all the documents necessary, and it takes them a long time to do so. Let's see here. Quebec separatist government maps, even today, have a dotted line, unlike Quebec's other boundaries, at the Labrador line, and a note saying that the line traced by the Privy Council. Yeah, this is, yeah, oh, here you go. So Myman knows about the story, but not about Isaac de la Penha's part in it. Well, he doesn't really have a part in the dispute between Quebec and Newfoundland, but he does have a claim to all of Labrador. And I'm going to show you the grant, or at least a transcript of it. But before I do so, we'll tell you who, well, actually we'll do that. We'll do the grant first. This is a transcript of the grant. There is, as far as I can tell, the only place I found it is in the Hebrew Union College, is a copy of the facsimile of the original grant. It's not available online. So without actually traveling to Cincinnati or getting someone on the phone, all I have is this transcript. And you can read it. William, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, Netherlands, and Ireland, Prince of Orange, hereditary governor and stadtholder of Gelderland, etc., 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 be it known, whereas in the year 1677, certain territories situated in the northern part of America were discovered and taken possession in our name. By the way, the Inuit Indians probably take offense that they was discovered then. So he says that in 1677, Labrador was discovered and taken for England for William III, and so it is. And I'm reading from the last paragraph. We, acceding to the request of Joseph de la Penha, a citizen and resident in the town of Rotterdam, by virtue of the aforesaid taking possession, I have granted and do grant by these presents to Joseph de la Penha all of this area which he describes, and all of the woods, forest, game preserve, rivers, fruits, fisheries situated therein, with full right of hereditary and perpetual tenure for him and his legal heirs and descendants, men and women, comfortably, conformably to the regulations of feudal law. So, and you can go on, we can read the whole thing. There is no doubt this is a complete grant of this land of Labrador to Joseph de la Penha of Rotterdam in the year 1697. The original language of the document, interestingly enough, is in Dutch, and it was executed in Holland, in the Netherlands, at the palace of William III, the summer residence of William III, Loo. So that's interesting because there is no copy in English in England of this grant. It was done in Amsterdam to the resident of Rotterdam, Joseph de la Penha. Interestingly, the de la Penha took it very seriously, and Joseph de la Penha dies in 1731. His son David confirms the grant. This is then William IV, I believe, in 1732. With again, there's a writing in official confirmation of the original grant, which then gets confirmed again in 1768 by David's younger brother Daniel de la Penha. So throughout the 18th century, the family of de la Penha is making sure that their rights are reconfirmed over and over again from this original grant of land. Interestingly enough, who is Joseph de la Penha? Joseph de la Penha was a very wealthy merchant from Rotterdam, a Portuguese Jew. I think he actually may have been born in Portugal. It's a little bit unclear. But he is a resident of Rotterdam, and he is a wealthy merchant. We know this because of his will, which is, you can get a copy of it, and notary documentation from Amsterdam or from the Netherlands, where he gives a large amount of money to all of his children and the residue to his son David. And so we know that he was a very wealthy merchant. But he's something else also, at least probably, because he doesn't only appear as a merchant. He actually appears in the Teshuvot of Jacob Sasportas. Yaakov Sasportas has a famous collection of Sheilot Teshuvot called Ohel Yaakov. And here in the 56th responsum is addressed Le'ir Rotterdam. Yagain Aleim Elohim, the God should protect that city. Lahagavir Navon V'chashuv Kvod Harav Yosef de la Penha. Yosef de la Penha. So here's a question addressed from Joseph de la Penha in the early 18th century to Jacob Sasportas in Amsterdam. I'm not going to go through the whole teshuvah here. It all has to do with the rights that a certain person were given to trade and to be a money exchanger, and someone else who starts to encroach upon those rights. The facts are not all that interesting. The decision's not all that interesting. The thing that's interesting is the person who the teshuvah is addressed to, which is Joseph de la Penha, the same person who was granted Labrador by King William III of England. Okay, with me so far? Hope so. Okay. So what happens? Basically, what happens is the search for the documents took a long time, and so they couldn't perfect their claim in court in England nor in Labrador. Nor in Newfoundland. And then World War II breaks out, and so these papers are just sitting there and were never heard by a judge. Nothing ever came of his claim other than they filed some papers and that was it. And so after his death, he died. Isaac de la Penha dies in 1930, I think 1937, 1936. World War II breaks out. The claim is his sisters continue the claim. He still has a lawyer. They're still trying to move on it and collect all the documentation they need to perfect their claim. And then World War II breaks out. And then after that, in 1950, the family gets together and they try to make another go of it. And here is an article from the Jewish Telegraphic JTA from 1950 about their claim. They're starting it again in 1950. And it tells you a kind of sad story that the Labrador case came to light in 1927 when Isaac de la Pena, that's our Hazzan, a Montreal Jew, a direct descendant of the Amsterdam merchant, filed a lawsuit claiming Labrador. The case had been prepared for several years, and a representative of the family was going from Holland to Canada to support the claim, but World War II broke out, and everything was delayed, and many members of the family were killed in concentration camps. The case came up again after the war, when a number of Belgian descendants sought to contact Mr. Meliado, one of the Dutch descendants, and Mr. Meliado formed a commission together with all the other descendants of the De La Pena family living outside of Holland and begin another suit. Nothing happens of this one either, by the way, and it's basically dismissed before any real hearings or anything. But what happens in the interim from 1926 till 1950 is they find all of the documents that were referred to earlier. They find the original or a copy of the original 1697 grant. They find the 1732 reconfirmation of the grant to his son. They find the 1760 confirmation again to the brother of the second grantee. And they even find also where the claim was, the son of Isaac de la Pena, of Joseph de la Pena, actually had to defend his claim against someone who tried to do some fishing over there, and he asserts his rights against him. So there's a lot of paperwork in the 18th century, which is all found from 1927 to 1950, when nothing really comes of it. And then in 1983, or 1984, a grandson of Isaac de la Pena, who's a medical doctor who lives in North Carolina, decides that he'll have a go of it again. His name is Daniel de la Pena, and he hires a lawyer, and he brings suit for ownership of Labrador. I mean, you have to. The idea is so insane. I mean, it's just insane. But he tries because I think when you are a descendant of a grant that is so absolute in its language to the him and his heirs forever, you feel pretty connected, even though your ancestors never went there, you never did anything to it, you never did anything to own the land, you didn't build a building there, you didn't live there, but somehow you've got the paper. And so he goes to court in St. John's Island or whatever it is, and tries to make a claim, which is dismissed. He then appeals it to the Canadian Supreme Court, and it's also dismissed. And that's where things lay and end. The story ends. So that's my end of my story for you. I don't know. I hope you enjoyed it. But Isaac de la Pena, Hazzan of Sheretz Israel, owner of Labrador, at least arguably. So, okay. Thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording and let you all speak here.